Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In our study of stylistics and the study of literary devices, also our understanding of what stylistics comprises of, how it mixes the approaches of linguists towards a text or its analysis, and how it also takes into account the theories of the literary critics. Now that we understand stylistics as a subject or discipline that combines the understanding of linguistics and the understanding of literature and its analysis for the sake of arriving at a different and vigorous method of analysis of literary writings. And this analysis that initiates from the understanding and analysis of literary writings can be further expanded and applied on any type of discourse that we come across in our life. Either it is a discourse that involves the use of language in any field, whether it is advertisement or the discourse of the news or the television discourse or the understanding and analysis of movies, documentaries, talk shows, or even the ordinary speech and discourses between people of various, you can say, disciplines or professions. Even the analysis can be applied to other less, authentic literary forms like songs or jokes or colloquial speeches as well, even political speeches too. Now the purpose is to know how language works, how language is formed, and what are the ways that a reader would react to language. What are the ways in which language can put a message across to the reader, how effective it would be, how much impressive it would be, and what are the basic ingredients that a text and a discourse must have in order to communicate something. And when we talk about the idea of effects of language or the effects of the discourse, we look at it from the perspective of a reader. A writer has presented an idea to the reader to make the reader discern a specific or particular meaning. He intends either to persuade the reader, he tends to either impress the reader, make him sympathize or take a stance, be angry, or it may be something like a propagandist writing as well. Now every type of writing persuades a reader, impresses a reader, makes the reader either side with the opinion of the writer or take a different stance. Now, if this is the effect of any writing, either it's poetry, novel, drama, or any speech or prose essay, it means that language is vital to conveying messages, to producing effects, and to impressing and convincing the readers. Now, in our study of stylistics, we have up till now covered many aspects that are important and integral part of any writing. Either it is taken from the perspective of the writer or it is taken from the perspective of a reader. Today we will look at one of such very important aspects of writing, especially literary writing, that we refer to as literary perspective, narrative perspective, or narrative point of view. Now, narrative point of view, what it is, what are its various types, what are its functions, how is it created, how can it be located in a text, is what we will learn today. We will first observe what is narrative perspective in literary writings, how is it created, what is its importance. Narrative perspective or literary perspective is the way a story is told. For example, there would be a voice within a text that tells us the story, that presents to us the story. Now, narrative voice is that of a narrator, the one who tells the story. Now, a story can be told from many perspectives. A story can be told from many angles and from different people's perspective or point of view. There can be a single voice in a text telling us the story. There can be multiple narrators in the story. Now, what are these narrators? What are the various kinds of narrative perspective? and how is it formed, and what effect does a narrative voice have on a reader? Narrator is the one who tells the story, who narrates the story, who tells the events, who tells about the experiences of a character or a person. If we look at the narrative perspective from the point of view of novel, it would be more appropriate to locate a particular narrative perspective, or to find out what are the effects of narrative voice or narration and narrative perspective on the reader. So, as narrator is the person telling the story in the novel or in fiction. Novel contain simple stories which in their telling become complicated. Now, this aspect, that is narrative perspective, would sound a bit complicated on the very basis that when we are reading any novel or a story, hardly do we as students pay attention to who is telling us the story. Our focus on reading a story or a novel mostly is on the ideas being told, on the action, plot, characters, situation, setting. But what is the narrative voice? Who is the teller of the story is what usually is ignored. Now, today's discussion will let us know the importance of narrative voice or the narrator, how important the narrator is. And we must know, or we would be able to understand through our discussion, that the narrator is not always the novelist. We assume that a novelist, for example, Dickens tells us, so this is Dickens' perspective. It might not always be the case that only a novelist himself or herself is narrating the story. The novelist at times, or most of the times, creates a persona, creates a narrative voice to put the message across to the reader, to narrate the story and the events. Now, what types of narrators he may create? There might be narrators like a character that is the part of the story or the novel might himself become the voice of the very story or the novel. We would see the events, we would see the descriptions through the eye of a character that is part of the story or the novel. Then there might be a narrator who may not be the part of the story, but who seems to be intrusive or all-knowing narrator, as if he knows the events, what is happening, who the people are, what are the situations and the experiences of the people. He might be giving a judgment also, he might be giving advices as well. So, any character can become a voice or narrative voice, or even the novelist or a storyteller might create an all-knowing persona who gives his judgment or who gives his opinion on the events and actions of the characters in the story. So, novels may contain a simple story that is, a story that might include certain tragedies, certain upheavals in the life of characters. There might be antagonism or rivalry and the friendship as well, and then there might be the conflict rising and then resolution, which would bring all the strands of the story together to lead to the culmination of the story into either a happy or a tragic ending. Now, story might be simple, the plot might be simple, as beginning with the exposition, leading to climax, and then to the denouement or the resolution of the story. But how the story is presented, who tells the story, who narrates the story, this is the mode or the way which might differ or vary in various novels and stories. And this is where we need to really be very careful in our understanding as stylisticians or as analysts of the text. So, there are two overlapping ways in which a novelist can complicate matters. At the novelist's disposal, there are two ways that he can use to complicate the understanding, to make the writing more intricate and difficult for the reader to understand and judge, or make it less predictable. One way is by introducing complications in the content. Now, complications in the content might be the disturbances, the hindrances in the action of the story, in the pursuit of certain desires of the characters through antagonism or through upheavals and difficulties that they may face or hardships that they may face during the course of the story. So if a writer does not choose to complicate the events, he can tell us the story in a complicated way. So the inclusion of the mass details about people, places, events in the story, this seems substantially, potential area where the writer can complicate issues and make it a little less easier for the reader to discern what is to happen in the story, because in this way the events of the story would become less predictable. The other way in which a writer can complicate the issues or complicate the matters in the story is by the way of the telling of the story, is by the way he or she chooses to narrate the story. A story can be told in many ways, for every narrator will see things and incidents from a different point of view. So we also refer to the narrative perspective or narrative skill as point of view. If you are asked to discern or determine the point of view of the story, it means that you are asked to locate the narrator from whose perspective the story is told. Now, narrative point of view is different from general idea of point of view. Point of view might be taken as your opinion about something, but here we are using the word point of view with reference to the narrative point of view or the narrative voice. So this is how it differs. The general use of the term point of view means opinion, your opinion, my opinion, anybody else's opinion. But here we are using the term point of view. That is why it's there in the bold letters in the presentation too, on the slides as well, that this point of view refers to the narrative point of view, the narrative voice. Now, the narrative voice might be for a layman, the writer himself or herself. That it is the writer, Dickens or Eliot or Jane Austen, telling the story. Of course, the story is originally produced by an author, but the author might have created a persona either in the form of a voice who is all-knowing within the text and is telling about the characters in the third person, or the narrative voice might be a character himself telling the story in first person narrative with I. So these are the ways a writer can add variety, or he can even complicate the matters for the telling of the story to the reader through the variation in narration. Earlier novelists like the classical novelists or the Victorian novelists, as you might have read George Eliot, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, they were quite confident of their grasp and understanding of life. And at the end of the 19th century, in the works of Victorians like Hardy and the modernists like Joyce and the stream of consciousness writers like Virginia Woolf or Joseph Conrad, all sorts of experiments with the narrative voice and method of narration begin to take shape. And they take place mostly in the 20th century. So the 20th century novel and story writing or fiction writing relies heavily on the experimentation within the telling of the story, within the narrative point of view or narrative voice of the story. Earlier it was the writer in George Eliot and Jane Austen who is all-knowing, who is all-seeing, and is aware of the events, giving judgment upon the characters, telling us what is to happen in the story, telling us even about the moral sort of predicament of the characters as well, giving his judgment. Like in Joseph Andrews, we find that Henry Fielding intrudes time and again to tell us what the story is, why is he telling it in this way, what does he mean the readers to understand, and what does his accomplishment as a novelist mean, or what does his accomplishment mean to the whole canon of the literary writing and the novel too. So there we find him as all-knowing and a more authoritative a voice within the text, who is telling us about the characters in the third person, but himself, his presence too, could be found within the novel, as there occur certain passages in the story, in the novel, in the conclusion of every chapter, or in the beginning of every chapter and book within the novel, which give the writer or Joseph, in Joseph Andrews, the comments of Henry Fielding. So there we notice a strong presence of the narrator as the author himself intruding into the story giving judgment, advice, and also his comments for the sake of clarity and understanding and to guide the reader as well. So we see that in the 20th century, all sorts of experiments take place for creating some variation in the narrative voice. And we see a certain confidence disappears, and suddenly the major novelists become aware of the gap between reality and interpretation of reality. Now, if we see experimentation being done in the order of narrative, in the method of narrative, we see the multiple personalities narrating the story, we see an unreliable narrator whom we cannot trust or whom we do not believe. We may see shifts from one person to another within the story as narrators. That can be called a frame story, story within a story. We may start listening to a story from one voice, but then there would be a shift to another voice or narrator, as it happens in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, that we find the story being told through the voice of an unnamed narrator. We do not know who's telling the story. And then that unnamed narrator introduces us to a character named Marlowe, who then tells his story in the retrospect or in the flashback, what has happened to him in his life. Now, there might be a single narrator, a character as a narrator, or there might be many narrators within the story, more than two as well. So a shift in narrative perspective too might be seen in the 20th century novel or the novel that came after the 20th century. So all sorts of experimentation is being done to tell us about this reality, that to capture the reality as it is not possible in fiction. That there cannot be any hard and fast rules of seeing the reality and life from a single perspective. We might have various perspectives, points of views, and voices about life, about events of life, about experiences of life. So the experience of life cannot be delineated or exposed with certainty or with very much the same angle or point of view. There might be many stories about a single event. The matter is only of perspective or looking at that incident or event. That is why there are experimentations being done, and the narrative voice or narrative perspective makes the story more complicated. As it was in the classical novel, there was very simple way to locate the narrator. We used to associate it with the author, the novelist himself. But now characters seem to be taking the charge of the telling of the story and developing a perspective and point of view of the story. Then there might be omniscient or all-knowing narrators. There might be intrusive narrators. There might be unreliable or neurotic narrators as well. So this is how the aspect or the style of narration too has undergone changes or has become more complicated for the reader. So stylistics also pays attention to locate the narrator within the text. Either it's a novel, a story, or it's a poem too. First we will be having a look at the narrative style within the novel or fiction. Then we'll look at the narrative style in poetry. So we begin our understanding of the narrative style with focus on the narrative in the novel or the narrative perspective and point of view in the novel. Now, there are many types of narrative perspective or narrative voice. The first one is referred to as the first person narrative. Now, the first person narrative is very simple and easy to locate. You can easily locate first person narrative novels as the story is told with the first person pronoun I. That is the first person narrative, and that is the central character within the story. So if a character tells a story, or if a writer creates a character and makes that character narrate the events, then we say that it's the first person narrative, as a character directly is telling us about the incidents and the happenings that he has seen or observed. And usually in the first person narrative, the story is told in retrospect. That is, a character having undergone certain experiences in his life is recollecting those experiences. For example, if you have read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, there we see that Marlowe, the major character, who has been through the journey to Africa, who has been part of the imperialistic missionary, narrates to us the events in the story. So the whole novel, majority of its part that takes place in Congo, Africa, is narrated by the first person narrator, Marlowe. Though it was another narrator, unnamed narrator, who introduced us to Marlowe, but then onwards it is Marlowe's story told in the flashback or retrospect, that is a recollection of the past few years' events and happenings in his life. As also it can be observed in the Victorian novelist Charles Dickens' novel David Copperfield, who is the character as well as the title of the novel too. David Copperfield, in a first person narrative, tells us about his experiences, his life in the novel called David Copperfield. Now this style of narration, that is the first person narrative, in which we meet a character who directly tells us his story about his life and experiences, it allows us a very direct insight into the character's mind. Now what sort of a story it is? As if it's a page from a diary, as if it's a look into the very depths of the mind of the character, because he is recollecting certain experiences, adding to it his wisdom, adding to it his wisdom as well as the reactions, how he felt at that time. Now how does he feel? What are the results of those experiences on his life is what is recollected. So it would make the novel a sort of a psychological revelation of a character. We get to know the personality of the person. He reveals his mind, he reveals his psychology, he reveals his fears, his longings, his suffering, his desires, his dreams, as well as his disappointments. So in this way, the first person narrative, since it is from the very heart of a character who defines to us everything that he has seen or observed, is what it becomes through this narration of the first person, direct narration into a psychological insight into the character's life. So often the experiences are narrated into retrospect. Retrospect means that they are looked at as if past is being recollected. It's a flashback or reminiscence or recollection of the past. That is why we call it retrospect, so that we are aware of the difference between the character's personality now and his personality then in the past. So this insight into the character's past allows us to see what he or she was like in the past and what he or she has become now. We find a difference between the immature and the mature personality of the character. The immature personality that he is telling us about, that is the recollection of the past, what he had been like, and the mature personality that he has turned into now, that is what we see now as a more experienced, mature and wise person. You can apply this maturity or understanding of the character's psychology to the same novel, Heart of Darkness, where Marlowe presents his past as he was adventurous, as he was idealistic, as he was a dreamer. He had imagined life to be adventurous and very much promising when he had embarked on his journey to Congo. Now when he is recollecting his journey, we feel this sense of delight, this sense of wonder in his quest for knowledge and his quest for the adventure and journey. But now, what sort of a man do we see who is telling us the story? He's a skeptical, wise and more, you can say mature a man who has learned that life is not as beautiful as it appears on the surface. The experiences of his life have made him come across many troubles and dangers and even the hypocrisies of the human character, that those hypocrisies have made him understand that life is not as beautiful as it appears to be on the surface. Now we notice through this a gap between the character's mature past self and immature past self and his mature present. So what he had been like, immature, inexperienced, simple, innocent in the past, contrasts with what he is today, that is more experienced, wise and sane a person that has learned from his life and experiences. In all other methods of narrative voice or the narrator or the narrators, these are principally observers of the events. Now, another important thing about the first person narrator is that the one who is narrating the story, who is also a character within the story, who has played a part in the action of the story, becomes a silent observer, the one who had been through those experiences. So he is a participant as well as the observer of the events. He had taken part in all those events that are being narrated, and he has been the very much active in narrating those experiences too. So it is the one who has been a participant within the story and the action of the story, and now he becomes the observer. So he has got sort of a double perspective, that of a man who had been through difficulties, hardships or experiences either of accomplishment or loss, and also at the same time he is the one who would give a judgment, who would give a perspective, who would give an opinion on those events and changes that have occurred in his life, just the way we have noticed in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, where Marlowe looks at himself as innocent, ignorant and idealistic person who was fascinated with maps, who was fascinated with distant and dark places like Africa, and now that he has been through that experience, he knows the very darkness of the human heart, the corruption of the Europeans, and also the disadvantages of imperialism and colonization, and how he has come to know about the insignificance of life, the illusion of life, and also the meaninglessness of life. How greedy, how lustful and how dark can a human heart be is what he is exposed to. Now the observer, who had been a participant too within the action of the story, becomes a sage or a sane man who tells us about what he sees or discerns as right or wrong. So we have seen in the first person narrative many things which strengthen that why a writer would choose to use the first person narrative. Firstly, because it allows a direct insight into the psychology or mind of a character, because the story is told from the perspective of a character who in the first person pronoun, that is I, tells us the story. There in the Heart of Darkness we see Marlowe, the narrator, telling us, I, Charlie Marlowe. So he telling us the story directly without the intervention of the author or any other character. Secondly, there is the recollection or the retrospect or a flashback. The story is told as if it is recollected, revised in memory of the main character or the narrator. Thirdly, we come to know about the gap between the two personalities of a single character. The mature personality that he is now and the immature, innocent personality that he had been before going through the experiences or before undergoing the changes. And fourthly, the first person narrator is the observer of the events. He is a participant as well as the observer of the event. So he gives his opinion, he gives his perspective, he gives the reader his angle of the story and his opinion on the events and ideas. Now, why do writers choose first person narrative? Because of its many strengths that we have yet discussed. This point of view is often considered effective in giving a sense of closeness and affinity with the character. So if a reader is to sympathize with the character, if a reader has to feel that he is walking in the very shoes of a character, this would give us direct empathy or sympathy with the character, as if we ourselves are undergoing the same experiences which a character is narrating to us. So the first person narrative with the voice of I gives readers a sense of closeness, a sense of affinity, and a relationship with the character, that we assume ourselves to be experiencing those things which a character has experienced. It can be very easy to get the reader to identify or sympathize with the main character. So a reader develops identity with the character. We, just the way in the watching of the movies, feel that the hero or the heroine is experiencing what we might be experiencing. So we assume ourselves to be those characters. We feel their pain, we feel that the mission that they are accomplishing is as if our own. So that same sort of affinity that we develop for a hero in a movie is what we develop for the major character in a story or in a novel when it is presented directly by the first person narrative. So we sympathize with the character, we are really kind of emotionally associated with the character, we begin to side with him, we take his or her stance as well. So the reader is seeing everything through the eye of this main character who is the narrator of the story as well. So everything is looked at from his or her perspective. That is, we begin to perceive things from the point of view of that single character. And what are the things that he impressed with, what are the things that he is annoyed with, is what we also get impressed with or annoyed with. So our sympathies and our associations are developed for the major character because he is the direct narrator of the story as a character, as a participant, as an observer too. Now that is why, because the story is told directly by the character himself or herself, we develop a psychological insight into the character's mind. We explore his idiosyncrasies, his complicated mind and personality too, which reveals the character's desires, motives, actions, even feelings too. For example, we have been observing side by side the example of a novel that uses the first person narrative as Conrad's Heart of Darkness, where Marlowe is the major character who narrates the story. Now we are exposed to Marlowe's motives, his desires, his feelings, his disappointments, his fears as well. Now how Marlowe feels about being selected for this journey to Congo. He was excited, he was overwhelmed with joy because he was an idealist who wanted to escape to some place which he had never been before. Now that he reaches there, what does he want to experience in the form of his relationship and his understanding of the natives or the blacks or the Africans? Now what sort of men does he see the Europeans have become in Africa? So that shock that he receives, the idea of the hypocritical nature of the people of Europe, that how the Europeans who act as wise, sane and decent people in Europe have changed in Africa, and they have become greedy, lustful and money-minded. They conspire against each other. Now these shocks which Marlowe receives are what he cannot fully admit as well, because he too is a European. So if he exposes the hypocrisy of the Europeans, he would expose himself. So he faces a dilemma. We have strange sort of a sympathy with Marlowe, who can neither admit his being the culprit, his being the European who is inflicting pain to the Africans, neither can he really side with the Africans whom he has been told about that they are the barbarians or the savages. Now this duality of character, that neither can he sympathize with the Europeans or side with them openly, nor can he be nice and kind towards the Africans, though he knows that they are not barbarians or the savages too. But he noticed the savagery in the Europeans, but he cannot admit that, as he tells a lie in the end also. So this is what we get insight into, which Marlowe as a narrator, as a first person narrator in Heart of Darkness, might not have said openly. But since we know his experiences, we know his desires, his feelings, his emotions and his personality, we ourselves discern that what situation Marlowe might be in, that neither can he rebel against the Europeans, that Europe and imperialistic machinery that he himself is a part of, nor can he sympathize with the Africans or call them sane or wise people, because they have been labeled as savages. So we come to know about the dilemma, the conflicts, the desires, the experiences, the hardships of a character directly, and develop a psychological understanding of his mind. So these are the advantages or the major and basic elements that the first person narrative carries. Now, after the first person narrative, that is through directly with the statement of I, we move to the omniscient narrator. Omniscient narrator is a narrator who can see everything and he relates the story. So now, the omniscient narrator is not a character within the story. He is an all-knowing presence that is either in the form of an intrusive one, that is a novelist, or the author himself. In omniscient narrator, we see everything is related in the story through somebody else's perspective, that is not the character. And the omniscient narrator can be unintrusive too. Either he can be intrusive or unintrusive. Intrusive in case of Joseph Andrews by Henry Fielding. There he intrudes into the action of the story by telling us what to expect, and then giving judgment about a character's attitude or behavior, giving advice to the reader to approach the story in this way. But at times there can be an omniscient, unintrusive narrator too, who knows what the story is about, who tells us about every character, but himself is not a character in the story. So that is to say, we are not really aware of a persona telling the story. So who is telling the story is unclear. We assume it to be the author. Most of the time, as the readers, we associate this omniscient narrator with the author who knows everything and is telling us the story. So we are aware of the fact that the story is being told from the point of view of the author or another personality that is not the part of the story, that is not the character within the story. So the action is presenting without many explicit comments or judgments. So the difference between intrusive narrator and omniscient narrator is that the omniscient narrator knows the story, tells the story, but he doesn't give a judgment. He doesn't give opinion on the story, about the events of the story. So you just remember that the omniscient narrator is all-knowing narrator who tells the story, who knows what is to happen, who is giving us the detail of the story and events in a novel or fiction. But he is not intruding into the action like giving advice or judgment upon characters or events, or neither is he directing the reader how to look at the story. Such an impersonal method is common in modern fiction and realistic novels like that of E.M. Forster. Now, if you have read E.M. Forster's Passage to India, in A Passage to India we find such a narrator who is telling us the story in the third person. The characters like Aziz and Fielding are there as narrated in the third person, but the omniscient narrator is all-knowing and all-believing, but he is not an sort of intrusion into a story. He is not giving us guidance, or neither is he giving any judgment upon the story and the characters and their actions. Such an impersonal account is used in the more modern novels like E.M. Forster's writing, even Graham Greene's writings, yet we do gain a sense of a narrator from the style the author adopts. So, with the omniscient narrator as adopted in E.M. Forster's A Passage to India, we do not find an intrusive narrator, nor do we find a direct narrator, that is the first person narrator, but it is an omniscient narrator that mostly a layman or a reader would associate with the author himself, with the writer himself. So reading that novel, we say that the writer presents these things in this way, or he is telling us the story. So this is the omniscient narrator that is all-knowing but unintrusive, and mostly it is associated with the author himself. Now, another narrator that is closer to omniscient narrator is intrusive. Now, how is intrusive narrator different from the omniscient narrator is the one reason that intrusive narrator intrudes into the story, addresses the reader, tells us how to judge the story, tells us how to judge the characters, tells us how to perceive some situation. So he guides us. He gives his judgment, he gives sort of moral advice as well. He might give a comment on the situation, story, event, like it is in Henry Fielding's Joseph Andrews, like it is in George Eliot's Mill on the Floss. So in both these novels you find an intrusive narrator who is all-knowing and commenting upon the events and situation in the story as well. Earlier realistic novels like Jane Austen, George Eliot, they use intrusive narrator who comments on the events and the character. So George Eliot's Bill on the Floss and also Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, they make use of an intrusive narrator who comments on the characters and events, who guides the reader, who tries to form or direct the reader's opinion and perspective too within the story. Such narrators frequently point to the significance of what they are presenting and often providing a moral interpretation of events and characters. So what is the purpose of these intrusive narrators? They want to tell a story with a particular perspective or point of view. They want to steer the writer's opinion. They want to keep them under control. They don't really give freedom to the reader to judge things or events on their own. They are guiding the reader, they are steering the reader to a particular direction as they want to comment upon the moral dimension of the character's behavior, personality, and their actions, and also they want to comment upon the situations, what they lead to, what they mean to in general, in terms of the social meaning of the situation or the moral meaning of the situation. So such narrators or intrusive narrators are controlling the reader's opinion, whereas the unintrusive narrator, who does not intervene or intrude into the story or make his presence felt within the story, are less likely to guide or manipulate the reader's opinion. So intrusive narrator is a bit manipulative because he or she comments upon the situation and makes us see those situations in the very same way, the way the intrusive narrator perceives it. So these narrators are used in Austen and Eliot's writings, and they are considered to be constructive figures. Constructive because such narrators are used by those novelists who consider themselves moralists. So a moral novelist like Jane Austen, who's commenting upon the idea of parenting, the idea of good breeding, the idea of good manners, decency, or the people of fashion and low fashion, high people and low people. Similarly, the moralist like George Eliot, who is commenting upon the sort of show-off and hypocritical people in the society, the ills of the materialism, and also the cold, calculated minds of people who are too much judgmental and harsh towards others. Such sorts of themes and ideas, if they are there at the back of the writer's mind, who wants to improve the society, he wants to guide the society and wants the readers to judge things from a particular angle, that writer makes use of intrusive narrator, because these intrusive narrators are constructive figures who want to guide the audience, who are concerned with the moral dimension of their works. But the intrusive narrator, its disadvantages, it may become disruptive too. How would it become a bit disruptive? Because the reader is controlled. The reader's opinions are controlled. So that is why, as an intrusion, he might disturb you, or he might feel to be a presence that you don't really want to be, aware of. So a little bit of disadvantage also lies there, that you cannot imagine the story to be looked at from any other angle. You may have a different opinion. You may have a conflicting opinion with that of the author, but the intrusive narrator would like you to look at the event from the angle that he has perceived it from. So that is what is mostly or generally perceived to be the disadvantage of the intrusive narrator, because the intrusive narrator mostly is the voice of the author. He would like to guide or judge things from his or her own angle or point of view. So a little bit of example, then we will recap the three types of narrator for your convenience, if it's a bit tricky to you. The narrator in Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, another Victorian novelist. William Makepeace Thackeray's narrator in the Vanity Fair is self-mocking, as if saying that life is more complicated than it appears to be. And this leads on to a standard complicated technique that can be found in novels. Now, Thackeray's narrator is self-mocking. Self-mocking as if he's filled with a feeling of embitterment, amusement, satire and irony for the self, for the life of the characters as well, for the people, for the social classes that he's representing. So it's a kind of a comic way of looking at events and things in which a narrator judges his own opinion, his own presence, his own self as open to criticism, as open to frailty and failures. So mostly the comic novelists adopt this technique of self-mocking or self-criticism. That is, they consider themselves to be the part of the very fragile and intricate society which is not perfect, which is imperfect too. So those imperfections which lie in people, mostly it can be looked at from this perspective that when you're telling a story, you tell a story by looking at things with a feeling of judgment. I may comment upon your behavior as if I am free of the ills that I see in you. Now here, this sort of intrusive narrator who is comic too. Now, comic narrator who is intrusive is self-mocking. Self-mocking in this way that he understands the imprecisions, the imperfections in people, considering that they are part of his life as well, that no one is immune to those imperfections. So this intrusive narrator who is self-mocking and critical of the self as well finds imperfection to be part of any human personality, not just the intrusive narrator who is moralistic. That intrusive narrator who is moralistic seems to judge things from the angle of a person who sees fault in others but not within himself, who says that what is there in front is having imperfections and what lies there in himself is perfect. So the intrusive narrator is in comic novels self-mocking due to the fact that he recognizes the imperfections, imprecision within the self as well, that nobody is immune to those imperfections, neither is he. Now this leads us to a standard complicated technique that can be found in the novels, that is being used by the Victorian novelists as well as that in the modern times too. When the narrator at all is self-conscious or complicated as well, we see that several narrators use even for the sort of first-person narrator as well on the fringe of the events that relate to the story. So the impression that comes across through the use of several narrators within the story is that events are more puzzling than any interpretation can do justice to. So if a writer makes use of multiple narrators, he may choose intrusive narrator as well, or the first person narrator too, or the third person narrator who is not a single person but story is told from 2 or 3 characters' perspective or angles. Now what does a writer want to imply through this technique if he has given a variety of characters or narrators who tell the tale? He wants to give this idea to the reader that life is not unified. Life is not to be seen from a single angle. If you look at a thing from 3 different angles, it would seem different. Same is the case with life. If one person looks at it, it would be a life that he sees from his perspective. But if another character looks at the same situation that one had been through, he would tell another story. So no 2 people's opinions about a single incident or event can be the same. That is something that we understand about reporting of a news as well, the reporting of an event as well. You ask a student in class, what did I teach yesterday? Everyone would come up with some different account, though you might have taught a single thing, a same thing to all the 30 or 40 students. But since everyone's way of perceiving reality is different, everyone remembers different details, everyone gives importance to certain other issues in his or her life. So the same is implied through multiple narrators in a story, that life is not as simple as it seems to be, that events may be looked at from these different angles, as every character would reveal a different perspective or angle on the same issue or incident. So No single interpretation of life can do justice to the events that happen in life. That is what the writers in the modern age recognize. That is why they complicate the narration of the story. They complicate the telling of the tale. And in the telling of the tale, the story becomes complicated because it is the point of view or opinion that makes a story rather than the very incident that has happened that makes the story. Observe a few examples to understand this idea that might seem a little complicated to understand. That if you have read Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, the very famous one and only novel that she wrote, that presents an extraordinary story of the characters' sufferings, their idiosyncrasies, their psychological dilemmas, their thwarted desires and their dreams. It is conveyed to us by two main characters. Now here in Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte chose to narrate the story not from a single perspective or a single person's angle, but from two characters' angles. Now these characters are involved in the story. They are part of the story, they are part of the incidents that happen in the story, and they have relationship with all the characters that they define in the story. But they are incapable of appreciating its significance. They are just the instruments telling the tale. They are participants and observers, yet emotionally detached with the events of the story. So this is how every writer has his or her way of telling the tale, either making a character be a very integral part, emotionally connected with the events, or make him indifferent and distanced from the emotional understanding of the events and the relationships within the story. Similarly, in Conrad's story, like Lord Jim and Heart of Darkness, we see the main character, that is the hero, that is the narrator, that is the one who explores the events and the places in the story, that is Marlowe, mostly in both the novels, Heart of Darkness and Lord Jim. Joseph Conrad has used Marlowe, the narrator or the actor or the character too. He is an intelligent man, but his understanding of what he sees is limited, simply because, like anyone, he interprets events according to his own beliefs. So he has got a perspective, he has got a world view of his own. That is how he would perceive things. You may disagree with what he describes things as. You may disagree with his opinion, his judgments, his point of view, because he is a single character who has his own personality, who has his own beliefs. So such narrators who tell a story from a single angle and have a very biased opinion about events and things, and a one-sided opinion of the events and things, are referred to as unreliable narrators. So to complicate the things further, we have another title for such narrators who tell an account on behalf of their own. That is what you may not agree to, that you may consider a partial view of a situation or event. Then you call such narrators unreliable, because they give you half the side of the picture. They do not reveal the other side of the picture or story to you. That is why they become unreliable, because they are relating one-sided opinion or perspective. So in Heart of Darkness, the narrator, that is Marlowe, can also be referred to as the unreliable narrator, though technically he is the first person narrator, but he can be further identified as unreliable narrator because he is telling us his opinion about the events. He is giving a one-sided picture of the story and his journey. What the other picture is like is hidden from us, because he has got his own beliefs and opinions which he is not ready to change. Now let us look at how to identify the narrator in the story or in the novels. Now that we have a look at all the three types of the narrator, firstly we looked at the first person narrator, who is a character in the story, who is the participant in the story, that we get to know about the first person narrator through the first person pronoun I. Then We see the omniscient narrator who is all-knowing, yet not a character within the story, not the voice that is there in the form of a person experiencing the events. Rather, it's a voice that is omniscient, that is that of the omniscient narrator who might be associated with the author. He's not the part of the story, he's not a character within the story. So it's an impersonal method of narration. So this narrator is unintrusive, but all-knowing. Now the intrusive narrator is the one who is omniscient narrator but who gives judgment on the events. So the difference between omniscient and intrusive narrator is that intrusive narrator intervenes, gives judgment, gives opinion, or advises reader, or he tells how to look at events. He gives a moral judgment, whereas omniscient narrator just narrates the events rather than giving any judgment or opinion on the events and characters. Now comes the point where we as readers or as students are supposed to locate the three types of narrators. What are we supposed to look at it? What are its strengths and weaknesses of these three types of narrations? We will look at it now. Now, when you have to identify the narrator in a novel or in a short story, in order to identify a narrator in a short story or in a novel or fiction, you have to think of the narrative point of view as perspective from which the story is told. You ask yourself, who is telling us the tale? It's the author, it's the character, it's the omniscient or the intrusive narrator, or there is a narrator who introduces us to another narrator too. Multiple narrators can also be there. Ask what is the voice the author has adopted, voice of I or the indirect narration that is of he. Then focus on the voice the author has used for the narration and also the work's narrator, speaker, persona. So whoever you identify, either it's the speaker, it's the persona, it's the hero, it's the narrator, it's the character. You have to identify that voice within the story. So we call it identifying point of view or identifying the voice within the story. So when there is a question of voice or point of view, it means we are referring to the identity of the narrator or narrative perspective. Now, just as important as a character is the narrator. Just the way a writer creates characters, he or she also creates a narrative voice or narrator to the story. So the writer speaks to us, or the writer narrates the events to us, the readers, through the narrator, rather than directly as it is done in an essay. So in fiction, the narrator is as much an integral part of the story or linked with the impression and effect of the story on the writer, on the reader, the way the characters are. So as important as the characters is the narrative voice or the narrator of the story, because here the writer is not directly addressing the audience the way he would address us in the essay. We recognize the narrative voice to be some person associated or created by the author, but not the author himself. So that is why it is very important that as important as the characters are, the narrator too or the narrative voice too is as significant. Now, to identify these three types of narrator, you have to see that and you have to keep in mind that the first person narrator uses we, I, rather than he or she. So if he or she is what the story is being told through, it means that it is the narrator who is the character. So most often the narrator is a protagonist or the hero or one of the major characters who makes use of the words I and we. So he or she is used in third person narrative, where the writer is telling us about a character. If I write about you, I would say that this is what happened to Sadia, this is what happened to Aisha, that she has been going there and telling this as if I looked at you and then I am narrating the story. Now, if I tell about myself, that would be through I. So that is how I would locate I as the first person narrative and he or she as the third person narrative. Sometimes maybe an observer and also a participant in the story, just the way it is, for example, in Marlowe's case in Heart of Darkness, that Marlowe is the observer as well as the participant who had been through those incidents and events that he narrates in the story. Now the third person omniscient narrator is all-knowing narrator, who knows what is going to happen in the story, who would meet what would happen now, how are these characters behaving, who is right, who is wrong. So this all-knowing narrator gives thoughts of characters. He tells us what the character is thinking, how the character is behaving, what his reactions are. So that all-knowing part relates to a narrator's knowledge of the character's motives, actions, desires and feelings too. So the third person omniscient narrator, as it is in Pride and Prejudice, as it is in a novel like E.M. Foster's, he knows how the character is behaving, what his thoughts are, what is he thinking at the moment, how is he judging the events, what are his reactions to a character, what are his feelings and emotions about some other character that he is involved with or is interacting with. So the omniscient third person narrator gives judgment about the character as well as gives details of the actions and the dialogues too. Then the third person limited omniscient narrator focuses on thoughts, feelings, actions of a single major character, because that character is the vital role that is, he's playing the vital role. So his feelings and actions are narrated by the omniscient narrator as if he knows it, how he is believing, acting, behaving or experiencing the things. Now let us look at a glance at the advantages and disadvantages now of all these three types of narrations: the first person narration, the omniscient narrator, the intrusive narrator. Now the first person narrative account is the eyewitness account, that is also used or expressed with the pronoun I. Now the eyewitness account, that is the very much felt and experienced by that character, it gives immediacy and adds realism to the story. We know that somebody had been through these incidents who is narrating the story, so it adds realism, it adds reality to the story. It also gives psychological insight because we get to know a character's fears, desires, longings, sufferings, etc. And in the first person narrative, the advantage, another advantage is that this character who is the narrator too is a unifying force in the story, because he knows all the characters, he knows all the events, so he chooses the order to tell the story and bring to the reader's understanding what he considers more important. He would narrate first or reminisce about it in the beginning. So such a narrator, that is the first person narrator, is also a unifying force that binds all the characters and incidents in the story together. Apart from the fact that the first person narrator hides the author's personality or gives us room for escape to the author, another disadvantage is that a character might give a biased or a limited opinion, a biased or limited account that we as readers might not agree fully, or we may agree partially but somebody else may disagree. So he gives a biased, a partial or a personal account because he is limited in his perception as a character or the single character. So these are the two disadvantages associated with the first person narrator: that it hides the author, it provides escape to the author, and it also gives limited account of the story and situation. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages of the third person omniscient narrator? Now, the omniscient narrator is godlike figure, that he is all-knowing, all-encompassing figure, who is not the character within the story, but who gives thoughts to the characters, who even makes us read their mind, who gives a dimension to the story, who makes us feel or look at the events in a particular way. Now, this sort of a narrative style is most flexible. Why? Because all the characters are given the same sort of understanding from an omniscient narrator or person who knows them all. So now the account is not coming from a single character, but the omniscient narrator tells us about all the characters. So it is more flexible, and the author controls the omniscient narrator. Now mostly we associate the omniscient narrator with the author, as it is the author's opinion that is being imposed upon the omniscient or all-knowing narrator, who is not the part of the story, who is just hovering over the story as if he's observing the events, judging the events, telling what the events are, but himself doesn't seem to be part of the story. Neither is he the very voice that can be located as directly as a character within the story. Now what are its disadvantages? Now the author can come between the audience and the story, because we associate the omniscient narrator with the author himself. So we believe that it is the author guiding us, judging us, or letting us judge the characters too. So he may become a hindrance, he may become a sort of shield between the reader and the story. Another important thing that can be a disadvantage too, if looked at in this way, is that since the story is not told from a single person's perspective as in the first person narration, here the shifts of angles as omniscient narrator might side with one character or might judge one character in another way, would add to the shifts happening in the angles in the story. So it might destroy the unity a little bit, because the unity of character and story found in the first person narrative is what you cannot really locate or find in the third person omniscient narrator. Then let's come to the last one, that is the third person limited omniscient. Now the third person limited omniscient is realistic in its depiction of the events and comments on the characters, because we see the world through one person, and it is the disadvantage that is a limited field of observation. So its disadvantages are that it is giving us the perspective from a limited angle, from a very narrow angle, that would be of a third person who is observing the story, but who is omniscient as well, but is not intrusive. As we have seen in the intrusive narrator, that intrusive narrator gives a judgment, gives guidance, steers the reader's opinion and imagination, and makes them feel about the characters in a particular way. Now this is the way we look at the third person omniscient narrator and the third person limited omniscient narrator and the first person narrator too. The first person is more direct, the third person is detached, and the limited omniscient narrator is more detached than the omniscient narrator, because there it would become sort of intrusive too, who would be guiding the reader, who would be judging the events and even judging the characters too, because a moral dimension is added to the story, as it would be a kind of guidance for the reader to look at a character from the perspective of either observing its flaws and exposing its weaknesses, and observing the advantages or the good within the personality of a character. So when such a narration is intrusive as well as omniscient, that seems that a writer wants to impose his personal perspective, his opinion upon the readers too. He wants to make the readers feel the same way about the characters and situations the way the writer has felt or analyzed them or perceived them while writing the story. So this is how we look at the case of narration, narrative perspective, narrative point of view, or point of view and voice within the fiction and short story or novels. So either you locate the first person narrator, the third person narrator, the omniscient narrator can have further types like limited omniscient narrator and intrusive omniscient narrator. And then there can be another type that I just told you about, is the unreliable narrator or a bit neurotic narrator too. So the more basic types are first person and third person narrative and omniscient narrator. Then the omniscient narrator can further be divided into limited omniscient narrator and the all-knowing omniscient narrator, or the intrusive omniscient narrator too. Then the first person can also turn into unreliable, or first person can also turn into further neurotic narrator. So just to make things simple for you, I have stuck myself only to the three types, that is first person narrative, third person narrative, or the omniscient narrative. And within omniscient narrator, we looked at two types, limited omniscient narrator and the all-knowing intrusive omniscient narrator. So when we will analyze the stories, we will find out all these types with their specifications too, for the understanding of the literary analysis of stories and prose fiction texts. Thank you.